And that really, again, helps with our educational linkages, but also with the people-to-people ties. And I think lastly, in terms of regional security, right? India is a country that has, disputed borders with Pakistan and China. It has sort of security needs, as energy needs, and wants to sort of use the United States to sort of enhance its regional stability vis-a-vis its neighbors, vis-a-vis its other security concerns. And in that sense, I think a lot of what we've seen on the counterterrorism side in terms of defense and security cooperation is designed so India can, help defend its sovereignty and sort of bolster its security position in the region.
Great. So why don't we take the other side then? These capitals, I think Washington and Delhi, I looked it up, are something like 7,500 miles apart. Americans sit on their, kind of our safe, sort of secure continent here in North America. And I think India can feel very far away. So I think from the US side, why is India important to us? What have we really wanted to try to achieve in the US-India relationship? And you maybe if you wanted to give us a little history of, what did change in the 90s? What was some of the thinking that went behind the sort of longer term kind of pretty determined push by the US to really kind of coax a relationship, a bilateral relationship and build a bilateral relationship over the last 2 decades. So what are we hoping to achieve? So what do we want to talk about when we sit down at the table with India?
Great question. I think, for many years, there's been a bipartisan sort of consensus in Washington, now I would say 5 presidents, going back to President Clinton, of that, having a democratic, partner, a 1.3 billion person economy that's going to be one of the world's largest economies in the coming decades, with the world's 3rd largest military that sits on the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean, an important sort of part of the world, which is part of a phrase you may have often heard called the Indo-Pacific, right? This strategic confluence between sort of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. That having a partner with such heft, working closely with the United States, not just in Asia and the Indo-Pacific, but around the world, that sort of inherently benefits U.S. interests, sort of India's rise as a regional and global partner. So I think that sort of strategic logic has been sort of the underpinning for almost sort of 2 decades. I think in terms of current administration priorities, broadly, I would sort of put it into 5 buckets. I think first is regional cooperation, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. You may have seen that President Biden hosted the first ever Quad leader level summit virtually just a few weeks ago. The Quad, had very nascent beginnings and then had some hiccups, but it's been going strong for the last 3-4 years and slowly culminated in a leader level summit, which people are very popular to sort of bring up sort of the China optic, but I think it's more about just sort of practical cooperation, whether it's on maritime security, counterterrorism, HADR, climate change, emerging technologies, you name it. There are a lot of sort of, I think, common interests among these 4 partners, and a lot of scope and potential for further cooperation. Number 2, I think climate is a big priority, certainly for this administration. We're really wanting India to be ambitious with its commitments ahead of both the climate level summit hosted by President Biden at the end of this month and COP22 later this year. India has demonstrated some leadership, including on the International Solar Alliance, mulling a 450 gigawatt, renewable energy pledge. That's all well and good, but more needs to be done because still a concerning amount of India's energy mix, upwards of 45% is still reliant on coal. So we really want sort of India to sort of be a leader and not sort of harm its economy, but be able to sort of leapfrog into sort of renewable energy sources where possible and mobilizing financing to do so. I think number three on I think, getting our trade and economic relationship right is very important. Um, um, we have, frankly, some differences and irritants on this front in recent years, but where we have a lot of economic linkages between our businesses, the people-to-people ties, Hyderabad and Silicon Valley, etc. So we're frankly not reaching the full potential of what is possible in our economic relationship. In the fourth bucket, I would sort of put our military and strategic and security cooperation. We've had a lot of milestones in recent years, including the Malabar naval exercise with Australia and Japan, and just today a exercise involving France, Japan, the United States, and India and Australia, La Perouse. So there's a lot going on there since we declared India a major defense partner in 2016. And I think that's largely on a positive track. And Secretary Austin recently had a visit to India as well. Lastly, I would say our people-to-people bucket. This includes, shared values, human rights, educational linkages, health cooperation. India is a major, vaccine producer. So all science and technology, I think, as the overall sort of trajectory of the partnership strengthens and accelerates, all of those things that, sometimes don't necessarily get much media attention, like the joint, satellite being developed by ISRO and NASA. Those sort of things sort of accelerate on their own momentum, and that's to great benefit to many, to students, to scientists, to common citizens.
That's great. Actually, you laid a lot of things on the table. So I think what I might do is sort of pick them up in a couple of little baskets and see if we can go a little deeper into a few areas. So of course, I'm going to start with economics because I'm an economist. So I think one interesting issue, right, between the US and India is just the sheer gap in the level of development between the two countries, right? So I think if you look at the IMF's World Economic Outlook, the most recent one, I think India's per capita GDP, and this is international current dollars, was around 6,500 per capita. And by contrast, the US is something like 10 times that level. So there's just a very profound, I don't know if that's the right metric completely, but it gives you the idea that it's very large, but it's still developing, it's still low income, and the US is, a mature, wealthy economy. But at the other end, you also have India being somewhat more, it's younger, it's growing faster. So I think the IMF is suggesting that India's economy is expected to increase as a share of total world GDP, somewhat modestly, not hugely, but up to about 7.5% or 7.6% in the next couple of years. And the US is on a slight decline. So you have, you have a large, rich economy that's very far along. You have a large, poorer economy that's growing fast. It seems like they're coming. It seems like there's a lot of room for disagreement, right? There's like different interests here. And so when you get into things like trade, foreign direct investment, I'm trying to think what else is kind of going on between them. You have stuff on bilateral investment regime. You have things on intellectual property comes up fairly often. I think there's some stuff going on digital services trade. There's stuff on agriculture. There are a whole host of issues. And first, I think I'd be interested to hear you maybe pick up a couple of those issues and talk about what you think might happen. But I also would be really curious to hear how reconcilable are these kind of the fact that we're at such different levels. And sometimes I think we talk past each other a little bit. It's hard to get our interests aligned.
No, great question. You're right. If you sort of look at 1991 as being sort of the critical year of India's sort of economic transformation, right? It's sort of engagement with the global economy, including the United States. It's 40 years is not that long of a time, right? So you're right. This is a country where fifth of the people still face dire economic challenges, poverty, etc. And so a number of people employed in agriculture. So you're going to have different perspectives, right? Particularly when it comes to sort of the WTO and stances on ag subsidies or other sorts of tariffs and issues. At the same time, you have that India, but there's also the dichotomy of this is a major services economy as well. Didn't sort of do the uh, export-driven growth as much as maybe some of the quote unquote East Asian tigers. So there, I think, again, in terms of links between sort of IT entrepreneurs in the services sector. We have about 2,000 American companies operating in India. I think that has been sort of a major success story, particularly in the last decade. But you're absolutely right that there are going to be differences, and even on the IT front, which I think for many years was a good news story, is we are seeing some of these protectionist measures, not just in India, but in other countries too, but particularly in the IT space, data protectionist measures, right? Restrictions on digital content, that sort of thing, where I think, not just American companies, but other foreign companies are really sort of trying to grapple, right? At one level, you have this strategic compulsion to want to attract as much investment as possible. Prime Minister Modi has been very proud of the fact that India has gone up in the ease of doing business index that the World Bank comes out with every year, and particularly I think in the light of recent frictions between China and the United States on trade, as American companies look to sort of diversify away from China, not just American, but other companies, right? They're looking at Vietnam, they're looking at other countries in East Asia. It's sort of, imperative for India to make itself a more attractive source of investment. And they've certainly tried to do that, I know, in cell phone manufacturing, right, with Nokia and Apple and Samsung and others. But at the same time, you still get the vestiges, I think what was called, during the Cold War, the license raj, right? The bureaucratic red tape. I mean, India has made huge inroads, but again, it's a federalist system. Some states are more competitive than others in terms of just bureaucratic red tape. But you also have these other compulsions at the national level, whether they be sort of data protectionism, just economic nationalism, trying to sort of favor Indian industries over international ones. And I think that then really butts into sort of their other goal that I mentioned, which is how do we get more investment and how do we draw manufacturing away from China and other places. And I think internally in India, that hasn't been reconciled. And certainly, this government has done major economic reforms like the General Goods and Services Tax, but still things like land and labor reform are very difficult in India politically. So that's a challenge. So you have all these sort of competing compulsions on the economic front. I think between the United States and India, we had about $150 billion in goods and services trade in about 2019 before COVID hit. Obviously, COVID is going to have an impact, but we sort of expect trade to sort of come roaring back, but we're still, again, at a fraction of our potential, right? I mean, Vice President Biden spoke about getting to the $500 billion dollar mark when he visited India back in, I think, 2013, and we're still a ways away from that. So I think there really needs to be flexibility on both parties, but also I think a realization among our Indian friends, right? Economic strength is strategic, right? It is the basis for their national power, their military power, and if they have these sort of strategic goals of drawing investment away from China, from others, of getting more ease of doing business, etc., that they really need to make some of these hard choices and think sort of constructively and long term about some of these actions that might seem politically expedient in the short term, but harm investor sentiment and harm market access for American companies. We did have some, trade negotiations during the Trump administration. We made some progress in some areas, less so on others. But I think if there is a concerted approach and flexibility, that we'll be able to resolve not all of them, but at least a fair number to sort of help boost the trade figures.
Great. So another basket of things that you mentioned, I think you called it mainly people to people. I'm sort of thinking of it as like social health policy, human development. But I think I might also put in there some human rights issues that also come up in the U.S. India relation. And I think I'm also going to throw in this little basket, immigration. So, we just have a lot of they're very different societies. They're, as I said, different levels of development, different religions, backgrounds. I mean, there's a lot of differences. But of course, two huge kind of raucous democracies too, with, also some things in common. And as you mentioned, a large diaspora, many Indians coming to the United States, many staying for some period of time, even raising their families and staying permanently here. So it's it's an interesting relationship. Not sure we always completely understand each other, which can sometimes set up some issues. So if we could maybe pick up a couple of those, maybe we could talk a little bit about the immigration tensions that have been there around some of the skilled, I think the temporary work visas and some of the numbers and limits that have been put on that. I think that's of a lot of interest in New Jersey, particularly. But also I'd be interested in, prospects for, you mentioned COVID and cooperation on COVID, and obviously the, unbelievable vaccine production capacity that the Indians have. Climate change, I think, was one that you mentioned as a place where there's some prospects for development or for some cooperation. And then maybe last, I think the hardest one are some of the human rights concerns. Some of the maybe, I think it's called majoritarian kind of rule, and some of the, anti-Muslim measures that have been taken. Kind of longstanding issues, but some of the gender discrimination and gender issues in India. And this administration, the new one, is clearly more focused on some of those concerns. So maybe you could kind of pick up a bunch of those. I think it'd be interesting.
Sure thing. I'll try to keep track. Starting with sort of the people-to-people immigration. Look, it's a source of strength for our countries. I'm the child of Indian immigrants who came from the Punjab region. It's at a time when politically our countries weren't close. Even before India became independent, right? This was the one of the original linkages, right? I mean, the first Indian migrants came to the West Coast at the turn of the 20th century, right? Places like Astoria, Oregon, or Yuba City, California. First, not just Indian American, but Asian American Congressman, Dalip Singh's son, elected in 1956 from California. And of course, successive waves starting in the 60s after President Johnson and Kennedy's sort of reforms. You had, the growth of a particularly Gujarati diaspora in New Jersey and New York. And then, of course, I think more recently, since the 1990s, a lot of sort of the IT sort of wave of the Indian diaspora. And it's sort of 4 million strong, very sort of influential and economically prosperous segment of the American population. I think by and large they support closer ties. Again, it's been sort of a bipartisan project here in the United States. I think there were many concerns, particularly in the last administration, about the tone on immigration, some of the restrictions, particularly on H-4s and H-1Bs. We think skilled labor is a strength for both economies. At the same time, right? If there are jobs that Americans can do, we obviously want American citizens to have those jobs. And in terms of the people who apply for those visas, we have a shared interest ensuring that they're sort of highly skilled and not sort of undercutting American workers. So with those considerations in mind, I think it's been largely a success story and a source of strength. in our partnership. And I can't speak to sort of future changes. I mean, a lot of this rests not with Congress as well, but you may have seen in the press about some of the administrative orders from the previous administration expiring and not being renewed. Uh, Number two, in terms of you mentioned COVID, you're absolutely right. India produces something like 60% of the world's vaccines for the UN World Health Organization. The Serum Institute is the single largest sort of producer. So when India sort of talks about being a vaccine for the world, it's not an exaggeration, right? And India has, I think, delivered something like vaccines to 60 plus countries, 68 by the last count. And they will continue to do so. At the same time, right? I mean, this is not something unique to India, but we're all facing compulsions at home, particularly just in the last week, where cases in India have crossed the 100,000 person mark daily in terms of new infections. So obviously there is going to be a compulsion to prioritize the domestic front, which India is gonna do. But at the same time, it hasn't halted exports, but it is trying to sort of be judicious, and it depends also on sort of global supply chains. But I think going forward, India will play a vital part in sort of the global vaccination effort, and not just for COVID, but looking beyond, right, at the next sort of public health crisis, and even just routine day-to-day public health challenges that don't necessarily get in the headlines. A few years ago, we worked with India to develop, a 50-cent rotavirus vaccine, which has done wonders with the World Health Organization. So I think this is a good news story, and India should definitely get credit for the amount of global leadership it's demonstrated, particularly on vaccines. On climate, as I mentioned, there's the Prime Minister Modi and his government has done a lot to sort of demonstrate global leadership on this. I mentioned, the International Solar Alliance. There's the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, very ambitious sort of targets in terms of renewable energy, a world leader in solar, nuclear power. We have a major investment by Westinghouse for 6 AP1000 nuclear reactors in Andhra Pradesh. So there's a lot India is doing, but I think the scale of the crisis before us is so large that we really want every country to sort of be ambitious as possible, particularly ahead of the COP talks. And but at the same time, we recognize, right? I mean, it's the third largest emitter. Its per capita emissions are lower than other industrialized countries, and we don't want to necessarily create this dynamic or the narrative that this is somehow, a trade-off between jobs and economic growth and clean energy, right? And fighting climate. You can have all of the above, and with right technology and investment, you can often leapfrog and not sort of go through what other countries have done. In India, solar is just a great example. Some of the largest solar parks in Asia, right, are coming up in India, but they need the financing. They need I think the international support, and if with that, I think we can be ambitious. And again, this is like with vaccines and COVID, an opportunity for India, which is still a developing country, to say, look, we face these challenges, but we've come up with practical solutions, and we want to be a global leader, and that can then help inspire action with other countries in the G77 or the developing world. On human rights, this is an area of difference sometimes between our Indian partners and the United States. My perspective is look, there are some concerning trends. We should not shy around, and we are too confident democracies, right? Our constitutions begin with "we the people." I mean, the father of India's constitution studied at Columbia. There is that linkage between values and shared principles as fellow republics. And we're not perfect either. You know, our approach should not be to sort of wag the finger and say we got it right. But I think the spirit that should really drive us is to form a more perfect union, right? That should be the spirit, and we should be able to have a candid conversation where on areas where we don't disagree or where there are concerns, and see how we can sort of work together, because we have, you know, a stake in the resiliency and success of Indian democracy. It's a model for the world, right? In the 1940s and 50s, many political scientists did not think that a country this poor and this diverse, you know, with disputed borders that had, you know, 5 conflicts with its neighbors, various insurgencies, could survive as a democracy. And despite sort of the ups and downs, including, human rights incidents, communal violence, you know, the suspension of the Constitution in the late 70s, Indian democracy has been largely resilient. And there have been successive peaceful elections. The military hasn't been involved in civilian affairs. These are all things to tout, but we want that sort of good news story and that resiliency to sort of expand and continue to grow, and not sort of retract or degrade in any sort of way. So I think in that spirit of, you know, let's form more perfect unions. We're not perfect either. We should be able to have a good, candid conversation when it comes to shared values and human rights. I'm forgetting the last issue that you mentioned.
Actually, I think that was it. I think you just
Okay.
wow, I'm impressed. So the final sort of set of broader issues is, I would say, political, military, well, really military security cooperation. So, I think the Quad meeting got quite a lot of attention. And for those who maybe don't know, but the India, Japan, Australia, U.S. relationship. And it drew a lot of attention to the role that India could play. I think mainly, the press was covering it as, countering China's influence in the Indo-Pacific. You were characterizing it as something a bit broader than that. Lloyd Austin, I think, as part of that outreach, was in New Delhi as part of his first trip abroad. So, and I think there's some kind of defense partnership agreements. I can't remember the name for that, but I'm sure you'll know, that have been developed. So I think this is, it wasn't just a Quad meeting that came out of the blue, right? People have been working on this for quite some time. So could you talk a little bit about that? People have said, the new Asian NATO, which seems a little much. But so what is going to be the nature of this sort of defense cooperation? Is it, joint exercises? Is it, technology sharing, arms sales? Is it, joint ventures in defense and space? What does it hold? And, kind of how are the two countries coming together around defense and security?
Right. I'll take that in 2 parts, because I do want to be careful in differentiating the Quad from our bilateral defense and security partnership. So you're right that the Quad has been, in the works for many years. Sort of had its, very nascent beginnings when the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and it wasn't even sort of a formal grouping. We had some, exercises in 2007. It then sort of fell apart due to some unease from Australia. We then revived it a decade later in 2017 by very sort of low-level meetings at the assistant secretary level, and sort of built it up to sort of deputy sort of level meetings, and we sort of had then ministerials, and then we had a trilateral leader summit with Japan and India and the United States, and then finally the Quad leader level summit, which sort of I think marked a sort of a new milestone. And I would very hesitantly, often people call it the quadrilateral security dialogue, or worse, Asian NATO. It is not that. These countries, it's no secret, do have concerns about China and some of its behavior in the region. But apart from that, the Quad, I think, represents a channel to pursue like-minded cooperation and advance like-minded interest in an important part of the world. And I think partly it is also just, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Indo-Pacific construct, right? That we cannot view sort of East Asia separate from the Indian Ocean. So the Indian leg of the Quad is very important. And the Indians have and we have a very expansive view, right, of the Indian Ocean, goes to the littoral of Africa. It is not just sort of East Asia, right? And in that vast geography, there are opportunities among the four partners on things like maritime security, CT, but also when it comes to working with the countries in the region, right? Like how can we leverage our collective strength to provide, quality and transparent infrastructure, right? How can we, engage on fisheries, on climate, on, emerging technologies. I mean, you name it, there's every sort of aspect of our cooperation. There could be a Quad element because each of these countries, right, have a lot to offer. Australia is an old treaty ally. Japan has a great sort of technological base, right? India has a lot of human resources and sort of soft power assets that it can bring. And obviously the United States, we've been a Pacific power since the earliest days of our republic. So I sort of see the Quad as not some sort of zero-sum construct, but as a way to sort of bring like-mindeds together and to help ensure a region in Indo-Pacific where every nation can sort of prosper together and not to sort of be exclusionary. I mean, the Chinese sometimes take exception to that. And to that, it's the problem is not the Quad. It's frankly some of China's own behavior in its neighborhood. That's the cause for concern and some of the concern we're hearing from neighbors. So there's no need to sort of hold the Quad as some boogeyman or Asian NATO. On bilateral defense and security, and Secretary Austin was out in India in March, not really in relation to the Quad, but as a standalone trip. And I think, the first trip by the Secretary of Defense to a non-treaty ally, which I think says a lot about our relationship with India. As I mentioned, during the Cold War, there was a dynamic where, India viewed us as being a closer security partner for Pakistan and then for India. And that really put a limit what we did in terms of security cooperation, though notably in 1962 under President Kennedy, we did provide a lot of assistance during the Sino-Indian War of 1962. That changed in, again, the 90s. The Malabar naval exercise that I mentioned began in 1992. It's one of our oldest exercises. It now includes Japan and Australia. I think the next sort of major milestone was under the Bush administration. We had the civil nuclear deal, but that really sort of also opened up defense cooperation with the 2005 U.S. India Defense Framework Agreement signed by then Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. So that really, I think, laid a foundation for where we wanted to go with our security cooperation and really made defense sort of a central pillar of our overall partnership. And under the Obama administration, we designated India a major defense partner, which is something that's found in legislation as well. And I think that was in recognition that India was it wasn't a treaty ally. India, for its own reasons, will never be a treaty partner, but it is an important strategic defense partner, and that designation was meant to sort of get at that. I think today, and in recent years, our defense cooperation has largely rested on sort of three broad lines of effort. One is defense sales. We've had $20 billion in authorized defense sales since 2008. India is today the second largest operator of C-17 and P-8 aircraft. This is, good, not just for obviously American firms. It supports jobs here at home, but also in terms of interoperability, right? The more common platforms we operate, the more we can better engage during exercises and during working groups, et cetera. India obviously has a big desire for diversifying its defense imports and promoting its indigenous development. And, many American firms have involved in sort of the Make in India effort. Boeing, Lockheed both have major facilities in Hyderabad to make components for C-130s or Apaches or Sikorsky helicopters. So we sort of recognize that. And also we launched an initiative in 2012 under Secretary then Ash Carter, he was deputy at the time, later SecDef Carter, called the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, DTTI. And now this will be the third administration that DTTI has really tried to see how we can not just do the buyer-seller paradigm, but co-develop new defense technologies and platforms. So that's a very exciting initiative we're proud to be part of. The second sort of leg is interoperability. I mentioned the platforms. We signed a number of defense enabling agreements since in recent years, Becca, Lamoa, Comcast, Hostak, Alphabet Soup. Happy to go into each one of those, but essentially they've been designed to sort of promote interoperability, meaning how can we communicate together better through secure means, through other channels, and how can our in extremist situation like a natural disaster and during exercises be able to communicate in real time and be able to enhance our information sharing. For militaries, having a common joint operating picture is sort of essential. And this is something we do with a lot of our partners. It's been very encouraging that India has sort of seen the value of this, right? It enhances their operating picture and their ability to operate with us as a strength for the Indian services. So that's been a major success story, particularly since 2016. The last leg is exercises. We mentioned Malabar starting from very nascent beginnings. We're now having exercise with multiple partners, Japan, Australia, I mentioned with France just this week. But these exercises are also becoming more organic, right? We're building a phrase our DoD colleagues like to use, habits of cooperation, where they're not sort of just a once a year, very formal affair, where we're doing things more organically when, our ships are passing through the Indian Ocean. And becoming more complex, right? We had our first tri-service exercise in 2019. Tri-service meaning it brought the Indian Army, Air Force, and Navy together for an exercise with American counterparts. So that's all been very encouraging. More interoperability, more organic engagements, and more habits of cooperation.
Wow. Okay. So we've gotten through a lot of issues. I had one more question, but I might hold it because I do want to give a little time to some of these audience questions. And anyone who's actually on and would like to just put something in the chat, I will look at those too. But we did get a few that were pre-submitted. So one of them I think is actually kind of a good segue. So this was from Mark Chandler. He writes, India has ordered Russia's S-400 air defense missile system, and for years has been co-developing and deploying Russian equipment. Turkey, although a NATO member, has been sanctioned for deploying the S-400. So how do we approach this issue with India-Russia military cooperation, which has been ongoing in some sense for decades? We're sanctioning Turkey for doing something that it looks like India is doing. How do we kind of work with them as you noted, they have a kind of a long history of wanting some independence, some strategic autonomy, or however people want to talk about that, being able to be determine their own relationships. So any thoughts on this, this possible wedge issue, threat of sanctions? I mean, what are we doing here?
Sure. No, it's a serious problem. I mean, I think we recognize India had a historic reliance on sort of Soviet and Russian era, platforms. Since the early 1990s, they've diversified away for their own reasons. I think largely in terms of quality, they were sometimes not happy with what they were getting. At the same time, Russia has been very forward-leaning in providing advanced technologies. Maybe India could not get anywhere. The S-400, we're tracking it. It's premature to sort of comment on the sanctions track. I mean, we've had some very frank conversation with the Indians that this, poses a challenge, both in terms of CATSA, the legislation, but also in terms of just, interoperability, and that they need to sort of be fully cognizant of these challenges. And we've also sort of said, there aren't sort of guaranteed or country-specific waivers. So we've been very, very sort of frank. I think we're going to have to continue to sort of work through this issue. There are no sort of easy solutions, and India has maintained that they need this for their defense requirements, and they're going to go through with it. But it's going to be an ongoing challenge, and we're going to need to sort of have a pragmatic and flexible way forward. But our Indian friends also need to realize, right, the spirit behind the legislation, CATS, is not to punish India or other defense partners, right? It's to sort of deny Russia financing for some of its malign activities, including interfering in the U.S. election, right? And I think it would be helpful for Indian friends also to sort of see that from the U.S. perspective as well, right? Some of the problematic actions, these CATSA did not come out of the blue. There was a certain context. So we're going to have to sort of continue to work through this issue.
Good. Here's another from David Tauger. He asks, how does the recent partnership agreement signed between Iran and China, which seems to be kind of built around, I think, some energy trade, some financial support, possible, I don't think it's not completely clear what the military cooperated, and military agreements look like. But how does that Iran-China, right? So China's, interest in building its own strategic relationships that sort of hem in some sense, India. How does that affect U.S. India relations? Does that put more pressure on them? Does that make them, more fraught or more just, pushing us together more quickly? And I also thought on this one, maybe we could also talk a little bit about the economic pact. So neither India nor the United States are members of the Indo-Pacific's two biggest trade blocs, the RCEP and the CPTPP, the TPP that went ahead without the U.S. So is that an issue for the U.S. and India relationship?
Sure, great questions. I can't speak to the specifics of sort of the Iran-China pact, but look, it's no secret, right? I mean, China has been very active throughout Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, particularly in the last decade, as it sort of expands its economic sphere of influence, Central Asia particularly. So Pakistan with the China-Pakistan economic corridor, Sri Lanka, Habantura port, for example, has become sort of a poster child for some of the things that are very problematic with the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. So what we tell countries is, right, I mean, you may look at China as some sort of way to sort of snub the West or an access to easy credit or whatever it might be, but there are a lot of cautionary tales from around the world where there has been sort of buyer's remorse, right? In terms of corruption that sometimes goes in some of these mega deals, and also in terms of infringement on sovereignty, right? In terms of India and Iran, they've maintained a stake in Chabahar port, which is abutting the Indian Ocean. India has a sort of strategic interest in having overland access to Afghanistan, which they do not have vis-a-vis Pakistan. So Chabahar has been a major investment project for the Indians. So in terms of sort of the India-China dynamic there, I think this agreement seemingly is quite comprehensive. I wouldn't necessarily look at everything just through a zero-sum prism, but certainly I think for India and for the United States and our other partners, what China has been doing across the region has been concerning. And as I said, there's a lot of cautionary tales from around the region. And even though we have our own differences with Iran, for a country that is so concerned about sovereignty, right, going back to their revolution, right, it's a bit surprising that they would have such a comprehensive agreement with China, given China's practices with countries in its neighborhood.
Okay, I have a question here from Jane Gardner, who says, I'm not sure how to phrase this, but then phrases it very well. As in, what direction do you think Modi's government will go in the future? Will it still have leaning into conservative values? And I might relate this to a question we also got submitted, which was on the BJP and some of the nationalist pro-Hindu kind of activities that the party has embraced. And do we think that the Modi government is continuing in that direction? Is there, likely that it's going to be checked in some way or slowed? I think the question is kind of internally what the politics might look like.
I know better than to always try to predict the future of Indian politics. It is vast and convoluted. Look, I think it's the Prime Minister's party, the BJP, has made a lot of inroads. It's won back-to-back majorities in Parliament in 2 successive elections. So they've had strong wind in their sails. They've frankly had some sort of missteps too. There have been protests, right, demonetization, the farmers, etc. But according to public opinion surveys, the Prime Minister himself remains very popular. They've slowly tried to sort of expand power at the state level. India is a robust federalist system. There are a lot of competitive, regional parties, and right now there are elections underway, and areas where there were traditionally sort of leftist parties, West Bengal and Kerala, Pondicherry. So we're still sort of waiting on the results of those. That'll just be very interesting to see how much sort of the BJP fares there. But despite their successes, right, I think federalism remains very robust, and there are a lot of regional parties that compete quite effectively vis-a-vis the BJP.
Okay, it's from Ben Wager. I think he was curious about your note or your comment that India will never be a treaty partner. And could you talk a little bit about what the reasons for that are? And he's speculating maybe it's Pakistan, or maybe it's just the general kind of instability along its border that just makes it a big risk for the United States, or is it coming from the Indian side, which is we remain and we have this kind of strategic autonomy, independence, and we are not going to enter into a treaty.
Right. I think it's just as a legacy of being a former colonial country and gaining independence right as the Cold War was starting, right, of so that non-aligned strategic autonomy streak, again, it's not the same. It's shifted a lot. There are a lot of nuances that still, I think, shapes Indian foreign policy thinking. I think also just right, traditionally having been sort of a seeing itself sort of Indian Ocean power, and not wanting to be sort of entangled in foreign alliances, right? The Iraq War was not sort of popular in India, at least among the public in 2003, 2004. But again, that sort of anxiety of what sort of compulsions treaty alliance has, when they look at sort of NATO and our East Asian sort of treaty allies, and that India is sort of has a different history, has a different sort of approach to the world, and that that is not sort of the right fit. And I think they also are very cognizant of sort of the right. There's always a junior partner and a senior partner, certainly in our treaty allies. And I think the Indians often, the analogy is they want sort of a joint venture approach, right, where they are seen as sort of equals in a strong partnership. So I think for all those reasons, probably a whole host more, which is why it makes it very sort of unlikely. And frankly, we respect that, and we're not seeking a treaty alliance with India, right? We will settle for a strong partnership. I think Secretary Mattis once said, I don't care if you're non-aligned as long as you're aligned with democracy. Sort of getting at, right. We don't have to always be on the same position on every issue, as long as we're sort of rowing in the same direction. We're advancing our strategic interests. That's good enough for the United States and like-minded partners.
Gosh, I kind of feel like we could just take that lesson at home a little, you know. So I'm going to ask you one final question, which is really just kind of a looking ahead question. So if you could look ahead a bit in the next few years, what sort of domestic trends in India, but also maybe broader regional trends, are you watching? What kind of, I don't want to say keeps you up at night, but what do you kind of want to kind of keep your eye on over the next few years?
Sure. I think, we've certainly watched, the situation along India's borders quite closely. There's a standoff which is, de-escalated a bit, but still ongoing along the line of actual control between India and China. So, India responded quite strongly by moving in reinforcements, by imposing limits on sort of Chinese investment. So it'll be sort of interesting as we of course support de-escalation, but it'll be interesting to see sort of how much of a paradigm shift, and some say it's already happened in sort of India-China relations, that if China is increasingly going to exploit, the disputed border to put pressure on India, right? Can that then there needs to be sort of a new modus vivendi, right, for India-China relations, and it can no longer be sort of business as usual, right? China can't say everything is hunky dory, but still sort of maintain pressure on the border. So it'll be interesting to sort of see how that unfolds, and India's continued posture on that front. On the other border, there rarely often good news when it comes to sort of India-Pakistan tensions, right? I mean, this is India has suffered from many Pakistani-based terrorist groups going back to the 2008 Mumbai attack, which killed 6 Americans, and then Pathankot and Uri, and then Balakot more recently, and there's been sort of military escalation as well in 2019, Balakot bombing. Sorry, the Pulwama incident. So as folks may have seen in the press last month, there was a good piece of news with a ceasefire along the line of control, the LOC, as opposed to the LAC, and both armies refrained from sort of engaging in artillery barrages. And there's been a lot of sort of speculation about sort of back channel discussions and whether this will lead to further rapprochement. And this is all very encouraging. I think obviously we have an interest in regional peace and stability, and we hope Pakistan can continue to sort of maintain pressure and take action against sort of the terrorist groups, particularly Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, that traditionally sort of played a spoiler role when it comes to attempts to sort of make amends or lower tensions. But we're in a good place currently on that, and I hope that dialogue and rapprochement will further strengthen. I think in terms of wider foreign policy, watching the Quad, watching India's engagement in West Asia, right, which this government particularly has done a lot in terms of reaching out to Israel, reaching out to Saudi Arabia, UAE, the Arab states. Traditionally, again, India wasn't so close with Israel and the Arabs, the Gulf states. That'll be worth watching. Africa, India is concerned about sort of Chinese influence there. They're opening almost, I think, a dozen new embassies across the African continent. So that'll certainly be interesting to see how they expand engagement there in areas where we can work together. On the domestic front, there have been a lot of concerning trends with regard to sort of, majoritarian policies and actions in Kashmir, or internet restrictions, etc. I think, we've been very clear that, particularly when it comes to sort of freedom of speech and the right to peaceful protests, that these are guaranteed in the Indian under the Indian Constitution, and that these should be sort of protected. So that'll be, I think, just something a lot of people sort of will watch. How India's sort of domestic polity and its views on human rights is developing, and whether or not there are incidents of communal violence. There was some horrific violence last year in New Delhi in February, so that'll be something to watch. In Kashmir, the government has made pledges to sort of restore statehood and hold assembly elections at the earliest opportunity. It'd be very interesting to see the issue along involving the farmers' protest and agricultural reforms, how that evolves, and how the Indian Parliament may take up potential other sort of economic reforms, later, particularly related to sort of land and labor, what they do on sort of the IT front, right? Some of the issues we talked about at the top of the hour. That'll be worth watching. And of course, the Prime Minister continues to be very popular. He'll have, another national election in just a few years' time, in 3 years' time. So whether, he can sustain what they call the Modi magic for a third term, that'll be obviously very, very interesting to watch.
Great. I just have to thank you so much. I was just hugely interesting to hear, just a lot of textured analysis of things going on in India and the U.S.-India relationship. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you everyone who came today. Stay tuned for future events, and thanks again.
Thank you very much, Raz. It was a pleasure. And thank you everyone for the great questions.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.